Welcome to the studio. I am so glad that you're here. Pull up a chair because today we're going to be painting some wild blueberries. And I also prepared a tutorial companion guide for you that has links to all the supplies that I used, as well as a step-by-step breakdown of the tutorial and a look at all the explorations that I did in preparation for this tutorial. So once this tutorial is over, you can take a look at these and get inspiration for further explorations on your own. So let's make some magic. Our supplies: clean water. I'm going to be using Payne's Gray, Sap Green, and Permanent Blue Violet. Some shimmer watercolor. 3 brushes. I'll be using the 8 for the background wash and then the 5 and the 1 for the berries and the leaves. Some masking tape or washi tape if you want to create a background wash with a hard edge. This watercolor paper block from Layton, it is 10 by 7. And then a heat gun to dry in between steps. The first step is very simple. We're going to create our very light background wash.
You can skip this layer altogether and add some special marks in the final layers.
But if you want to create a background, you can either do a very loose background like the way that I did in this exploration, which you'll find in the companion guide, where I just had very loose, rough, natural edges, or how I did in what I'll be doing in the tutorial, create a very hard defined edge for that background so that I can have fun exploring the elements popping out of the frame. And I don't have thick masking tape yet. I've ordered some, but it's on the way. So what I'm going to do is do 2 strips on each side of this washi tape.
I'm filming this tutorial in one sitting because I want to make sure I'm walking you through everything and giving you all the direction you need to recreate this piece. But that doesn't mean you have to paint it that way. If all you have today is a 5-minute margin, that's enough. Paint a layer, add a few details, and then go back to life. You can come back when you have another little pocket of time that opens up. That's actually how I create most of my work. Sometimes I have several pieces laid out at once, and if I have 5 minutes, I'll work on one for a minute, move to another, and let things sit in between. And sometimes letting a piece sit is a gift. When you come back with fresh eyes, you notice details you couldn't see when you were right in the middle of it. So take your time. Pause this as often as you need to. There's absolutely no rush here. Think of this as a little studio session where we get to paint together however much time you have today. And you can use only 1 strip of masking tape here, but when I'm creating a border like this, I like having a little more width around the painting. That extra space gives me more room to play with the composition later, especially when I want to intentionally break the frame and let some of my berries or leaves extend beyond it.
For the background color, you can pick any color you'd want. Just make it a very light wash. I did use in my explorations, I used yellow ochre, permanent red violet, a very light wash of Payne's Gray, which is what I'm going to do in this tutorial. And then this was a very light wash of burnt umber.
I'm going to pull a little tiny bit of Payne's Gray into the ceramic bowl, just enough to mix with a very generous amount of water so that I can get that really light wash. Now, before we add this pigment to our page, we're going to clean off our brush, and I'm using the number 8 brush in case I forgot to mention that. And with clean water, we're going to wet the entire surface of our paper. That way the pigment that we just mixed will slide easily and cover the surface area smoothly. Now, once the entire surface is covered with a thin layer of water, you can add your pigment, and you can use your brush for this, but I decided that it would be fun to just drop it on the paper and then just mix it around. Once we've got the layer the way we want it, we're going to dry this layer before we add the berries.
If you dry yours, try to go in one direction. I was swirling mine and I got these little water texture marks here, which is fine. It's a very light layer and I'm going to be adding some texture so it'll blend in. Plus we'll have the darker shades of our blueberries. So
you can either leave the masking tape as is and have your berries contained within this space, or you can remove the masking tape like I'm going to so that I can do the exact same thing that I did in this exploration where I have the berries and the leaves popping out of the frame.
you can paint your berries in a vertical orientation the way that I'm going to, or you can do it landscape horizontal like this. It's up to you. I'm going to do vertical so that I can hopefully keep a space here and add the words wild joy. In the resource guide, you'll find a few compositions for you to pull from if you need some inspiration. There are 2 with 5 berries and then 2 with 3 berries. I'm going to be doing 1 with 5 and perhaps a slightly different composition so that you can have another example to pull from. And for the berries, I'll be using the size 5 brush.
I'm using some permanent blue violet that I had left over from a previous expiration. I just added a little water to reactivate the pigment and then mixed in even more water to create a really light wash. You can approach this wet on wet if you want softer, more diffused edges, or you can work wet on dry like I'm doing here. I'm starting with a very light layer of pigment and then I'll gradually mix in a little more color as we go. I'm doing this freehand, but feel free to lightly sketch where you'd like your blueberries to go before you begin. You can reference those compositions in the companion guide. I'm keeping it very loose. I know that I want 5 berries and that I need to leave some space for my leaves. Have fun with this and take a little time to get to know your brush. Experiment the size of the circles you can comfortably create because it will vary depending on the size and shape of your brush. I use this size 5 brush almost every day, so I've built a lot of muscle memory with it. I already have a pretty good sense of the size and shape of the circle I can create. If you're using a brush you're less familiar with, give yourself a few practice circles first and see what your brush naturally wants to do. Now that we have our basic circles, it's time to add the little crowns or calyx to our blueberries. You can approach this in 2 different ways. For the first berry, I added the calyx from the side profile so you can actually see those little points extending from the edge of the berries. Or if you want the calyx to face toward you, you can leave the berry as it is for now. Once this layer is dry, we'll come back in with another layer and add a few small marks inside the berry to create the little crowns facing forward. Now we're going to start working with a slightly thicker consistency of pigment to create more depth and variation in our berries. Have fun with this part and let the colors move and mix together. I'm using the permanent blue violet and then mixing in a little Payne's gray for those deeper, darker areas. You do not need to control every little blend. Let the watercolor do some of the work and see what happens. I'm adding a richer, darker pigment toward the left side of each berry because I'm imagining the light source coming from the right. That means that the left side will naturally fall more into shadow. You do not need to be exact with this, just keeping a general light direction in mind can help give your berries a little more dimension and form. Now here comes the Payne's gray. A little bit of this goes a long way, so start with just a touch. I'm adding it to those shadow areas to deepen the color and create even more dimension into the berries. This is one of those steps where I really encourage you to slow down, explore, and watch what the watercolor does. There's something magical about seeing those colors blend and move into one another. If you don't believe me, scrub this section of the video really quickly and watch the pigment move. It almost looks like the color is exploding across the berry. I like to take my time here and pay attention to what feels right to me, but that might look completely different for you. Follow what catches your eye and what brings you joy. And remember, part of watercolor is accepting that we can't completely control it. The water and the pigment are going to move, blend, and surprise us. And that means every berry you paint is going to come out a little different. That's part of the magic. A little real life watercolor moment. I didn't realize that there was some pigment on the bottom of my ceramic bowl and it ended up transferring onto my paper. So part of the magic is also learning to be a little bit more careful. I used some clean water to loosen the pigment and then I gently dabbed it with a napkin to lift as much of the color as I could. Little things like this happen. We just keep going and sometimes they even become part of the piece. I felt like my berries needed just a little more Payne's Gray before we finished up this layer, so I added a bit more for depth. Yours might already feel ready to go, so take a look at what's happening on your page and evaluate and add more if you need to. I completely forgot about the leaves until after I dried my berries, but you definitely don't have to dry yours before adding them. For the leaves, I'm going to be using sap green. I naturally like to work in groupings of 3 because I love the balance and composition they create, but feel free to experiment with whatever grouping feels right to you. And if you'd like a closer look at the leaf shapes and brushwork I'm using here, check out the companion guide. I included scans of the different strokes so you can explore them at your own pace. For the leaf stroke, I start with just the tip of my brush on the paper, then quickly press down into the belly of the brush. That takes us from a very fine point into a nice thick stroke. As I move through the stroke, I slowly release the pressure and lift the brush again, creating a slight C-shaped curve that tapers back to a point. Then I repeat the same motion in the opposite direction to create the other side of the leaf and form this shape you're seeing here. It's done, I come back very carefully with just the tip of my brush to add the little center stem, followed by 3 small strokes for the veins. You'll notice that I repeat the number 3 a lot throughout my pieces, and that's because it's my favorite number and I feel that it creates a natural balance. The second grouping of leaves is going in the opposite corner of our first grouping. This helps guide your eye diagonally through the composition, from the leaves through to the berries and up towards this second grouping. Creating this kind of visual diagonal is one of my go-to composition techniques. I use it a lot in my whimsy journal where I paint something in one corner and then add another element in the opposite corner. It creates a sense of balance while still allowing your eye to move through the page. I'm going to go ahead and dry this before we add details to our berries. I've broken this tutorial down into 4 main steps in the companion guide, but think of those steps as a loose framework rather than something you have to follow only once. Depending on your piece and your personal preference, you might repeat a step or add another layer before moving on to the next one. Here, I wasn't quite satisfied with how deep the color of my berries was, so I'm going back in with another layer of color. No little marks or calyxes yet. I'm simply building up that base color until the berries have the depth I'm looking for. This layer is really about exploration. I'm adding color, blending it out, stepping back to see what's working, and then coming in with a little more where I need it. I'm still keeping my imaginary light source in mind, so I'm trying to maintain those deeper shadows on the left side of the berries. But ultimately, how far you take this is completely up to you. This is also one of those parts of painting where I get really focused. I do a lot of my painting in silence. There is something about those repetitive little moments of adding color and blending that gives my mind room to wander, think, and reflect. So take your time here. For me, this part can absolutely fly by. Explore what's happening on your page, make little adjustments as you go, and stop when it feels right for you. I'm going to let us settle into the painting for a little bit here. There's nothing new you need to be doing. I'm just continuing to add color, blend, and respond to what's happening on the page. So I'm going to leave this part quiet and let you paint alongside me. Take your time, follow what feels right on your page, and I'll meet you back here when it's ready for the next step. Now we're going to add a few little detail lines to our leaves. I mixed a touch of Payne's Gray into my sap green to deepen the color and create a little more contrast and texture. Using the tip of my brush, I'm keeping these marks really loose and simple, just enough to give the leaves a little more character and definition. This is actually something I didn't do in any of my previous explorations, and I think that's one of the really beautiful things about exploring the same idea more than once. The first time you paint something, you're often just figuring it out, but every time you come back to it, your eye starts noticing more. You begin to see the little details you missed before. You learn from what you've already tried, and suddenly your imagination has more to work with. That's when new ideas start showing up. So even though we're painting the same subject again, we're not really repeating ourselves. We're building on everything we've noticed and learned the last time and allowing that piece to keep evolving. As you work, take little pauses to scan your piece and notice what might need a little more attention or detail. Sometimes stepping back for just a moment helps you see things you didn't notice while you were focused on one area. I noticed a spot that felt a little darker than what I wanted, so I came back in with some permanent blue violet to blend that area a little more and deepen the calyx. These little adjustments are all part of responding to what's happening on your page. Now we're going to dry this, and it's going to be time to add all the character to our blueberries. I mixed a little Payne's Gray into my permanent blue violet to create a deeper, darker color for some of our detail marks, beginning with the calyx. For the calyx, I'm starting with a small oval using a very thin stroke. I'm actually letting my brush skip across the paper a little so the oval isn't perfectly defined. Then I'm adding these loose strokes that radiate from that center, keeping these imperfect and a little irregular. We're not trying to make every calyx look the same. We want to capture some of that unique character that makes every berry a little different. I'm going around to all the berries that will have the calyx facing toward me and adding those first, just so I don't forget where I want to place them. Then I'm coming back and adding the blemishes, the beauty marks, and those thicker brush strokes wherever I want to deepen the shadows and add more character. And you definitely don't need to add a calyx to every berry. Feel free to leave one or two without one, as though the calyx is facing away from you. You can see an example of this in the companion guide next to the painting elements section. Keep those calyx strokes really loose. Sometimes I'll even add a few tiny dots around them to suggest little folds, texture, and character of the berry. And to have fun with the marks you're adding around the shadows too. They don't have to be purely functional. Let them be a little expressive and become part of your own visual language. I love hiding little hearts in my paintings. Sometimes it's pretty obvious where I'm placing them. So I've actually tucked one inside of one of the berries, and I can already tell you that it is not the last heart you're going to see in this piece. Now I'm going back into the two berries with the side profile calyx and adding some of those same shadows and texture marks. This is such a great place to experiment and notice what catches your eye. There really is no right way to do this. It's about discovering what brings you joy. You can add dots, little expressive marks, or even swirls. Actually, now that I'm saying that out loud, I think some swirly blueberries might be making an appearance in a future exploration. And pay attention to the marks you enjoy making, because you might discover something here that you want to carry into other paintings. Sometimes you need to actually see a mark on the page before you know whether it feels like you. So if you're not loving what's happening on one berry, don't worry about it. Move on to the other one and keep exploring. The next mark you make might be the one that sparks something and leads you somewhere completely unexpected. One thing I've noticed the more I paint is that so much of creating isn't actually about knowing what to do next. It's about learning how to notice. Right now, I'm moving around the page, adding a little more shadow here, blending something there, and choosing to leave some of these marks exactly as they are. And I think that's something that develops the more you create. You start noticing what your eye is drawn to. You learn which marks you want to soften and which imperfections you actually really love. That's part of why I encourage you to explore instead of trying to make your piece look exactly like mine. Every little decision you make is giving you information about what you like. So while you're working, pay attention to those little reactions. What catches your eye? What do you want to leave untouched? What makes you want to add just one more mark? Those little choices might seem insignificant, but over time, they start becoming your creative voice. I'm adding 2 more little hearts here because this was a detail I really loved from one of my previous explorations. In fact, the exploration that inspired this entire tutorial. I love those little hearts tucked along the edges of the leaves, so I knew I wanted to carry that detail into this piece. And I think this is one of the gifts of exploring something more than once. Every time you create it, you start noticing what you want to carry forward and what you might want to approach differently next time. This doesn't mean something was a mistake or that it needs to be fixed. It's really about learning your own preferences. For example, I'm coming back into this berry with a little more shadow because to my eye, it's starting to feel a little flat. You might look at yours and love it exactly as it is. We're going to notice different things because we each have our own taste. But now I've learned something about mine. The next time I explore these blueberries, I already know I want to be more intentional about how I distribute my shadows because I love the dimension they create. And this is how your creative voice develops. You create, you notice, you learn what you want to carry forward. You begin to understand what catches your eye and what you value enough to keep repeating. I could have left these berries completely flat, added a few marks, and called them finished. There would have been nothing wrong with that, but my eye wanted the extra dimension. That little instinct, I want more of this, is worth paying attention to. It was definitely a journey getting all these berries detailed, but I really enjoyed the process. And I hope that as you're painting along with me, you're learning not only about blueberries, watercolor, and all these little details, but also something about yourself, what catches your eye, what you want to explore further, and ultimately, what brings you joy. These next steps are really all about the joy, so have fun with this part. You can add texture to your background, lettering, patterns, or some combination of all three. In one of my explorations, I lettered the words Wild Delight, and I loved how that turned out. So for this piece, I'm going to play with Wild Joy. If you don't feel comfortable lettering freehand, sketch it lightly in pencil first. You can use a kneadable eraser to gently lift some of the graphite afterward, leaving yourself just enough of an outline to follow. I personally love combining some loose script lettering with a serif style. There's something about that contrast between the two that catches my eye. But again, this is your opportunity to explore, try different things, because that's how you start discovering what you actually enjoy. Where you place your lettering will depend on the composition you created and the open space you have available. I'm using my number 1 brush here so I can get those really thin strokes, along with permanent blue violet for the lettering. I'm saving my Payne's Gray for the stripes I'll be adding later as texture for the background. And you want to do the lettering first so that you know how much real estate you have left afterward. And I also want to say, I don't know a lot about lettering. I know what I like, I know my own handwriting, and it's something I'd love to get better at someday. But you don't have to master something before you're allowed to bring it into your work. If it brings you joy, explore it. Let yourself play with it. You can always learn more along the way. I'm using paint for my lettering here, but you can use a marker, a pen, or whatever you feel comfortable with. Have fun mixing up your materials if you want to. I'm using paint simply because it was what I had on my desk. I really love the way the W turned out, especially how the little flourish came up and became the dot for the eye. And of course, I had some extra space on the side, so of course I'm going to add another heart because why not? Hearts bring me joy, and if there's room for a little more joy on the page, I'm going to take it. Now it's time to add some texture to our background. I'm going with this simple pinstripe pattern here, but you can absolutely take this in a different direction. Check the companion guide for a few of the other background ideas I explored. For the stripes, I'm not aiming for perfection. I'm just trying to keep the spacing fairly even and let the little imperfections be a part of the piece. I'm making sure I have plenty of pigment on my brush, and then I'm moving slowly and taking my time. I'm also leaving this section in real time because I want you to see how long these little details can actually take. We see so many time lapses online that it can start to feel like artwork just appears in a few seconds, but there's usually a lot of slowing down, looking, thinking and adjusting happening in between. So take your time here. Let the details take the time they need. I kept my color palette very simple through this piece, sticking with just the 3 main colors. But if your eye is asking for something different here, feel free to bring in another color. This is a great place to experiment, see how it changes the piece, and notice what catches your eye. Depending on your composition, you may find that you need to rotate your piece to add these lines. I'm visually carrying each line from one side of the background to the other, leaving little pauses whenever I run into a berry, a leaf, or the lettering. As I turn the page, I'm also using those open spaces to guide me. I'm not working from a sketch or measuring anything, so I already know these lines aren't going to be perfect. Instead, I like to create a few landmark lines in open areas first. Those give my eyes something to work from, and then I can slowly fill in the spaces between them and connect everything visually across the piece. I'm just doing my best to keep the spacing fairly even, and that becomes much easier when you slow down. So I'll say it again. Take your time here. There's no rush. If you're creating this in the margins of your day, it is perfectly okay to pause here and come back in another little pocket of time. I painted this tutorial in one sitting, but even within that sitting, I worked in sections, and a lot of those individual sections only took 5 or 6 minutes. I used to struggle with this so much. I wouldn't start something because I thought, I don't have enough time to finish this. And eventually, I realized I didn't actually need an uninterrupted hour. Maybe I had 5 minutes before work, another 10 minutes later, and a few more somewhere in between. Those are the little pockets of time I lovingly call the margins. And when you start reclaiming them, something really beautiful begins to happen. 5 minutes might not feel like enough to create much in that moment, but those minutes start adding up. You paint one layer today, a few more details tomorrow. Come back to it when another margin opens up. And then, a couple days later, you look down and you realize, I made something. That piece exists because you gave those little minutes a chance to matter. So please, don't feel like you need to finish this with me today. Pause, come back when you have another few minutes. Those margins add up. As I'm getting closer to the edge here, I can see that my lines are, in fact, a little crooked. I'm doing this freehand, and so a little variation is completely normal. And once you step back from this finished piece, your eye isn't going to inspect every individual line. It's going to read them together as a pattern. And all those little imperfections become part of it. For this last section though, I can see where my lines have started to drift. So I'm going to make a small adjustment. I'll gradually correct the spacing as I work toward the edge so that my final line meets the straight edge of our Payne's gray wash. We don't need to go back and fix every crooked line. Sometimes we can simply notice where we are, make a small adjustment, and keep moving forward. I'm also starting to notice that when I first began these lines, they were much bolder. They trailed off a little as they moved around the elements of the painting, but overall, the lines were pretty solid. As I worked my way toward this edge though, my strokes started getting lighter and trailing off a bit more. So once I finish this first pass, I'm actually going to go back through and add a second pass in a few areas to give the pinstripes a little more thickness and consistency. And this is all part of the process. As I've said before, pause every once in a while and really look at your painting. When we're focused on making one mark after another, it's easy to lose sight of the piece as a whole. Step back, take it in, notice what your eye is asking for, and then make those little adjustments. You don't have to catch everything the first time through. Now that I have that first set of lines as a guide, I can move a little faster on this second pass, but I still want to take my time and maintain good brush control so I stay right on top of those original lines. If you move too quickly, it's really easy for the brush to wander and create little areas you weren't intending. So even though we have that first pass to follow, keep your movements controlled and intentional. There's no need to rush, let those first lines guide you, and just slowly build up the thickness and consistency you're looking for. I didn't dry the piece between my first and second pass, so I'm being mindful of where the wet paint is as I work my way across the page. I'm keeping my hand slightly lifted and paying attention to the trail of lines behind me so I don't accidentally drag my hand through them and create a smudge. If that feels uncomfortable for you, you can absolutely let your first pass dry before you come back in with a second pass. I really love the process of adding dots or lines for texture because it's one of those parts of creating where I don't have to think quite as hard about what comes next. I think sometimes we put this expectation on creativity that we always need to be coming up with something new, a new idea, a new technique, a new project. But creativity can also be repetitive. Sometimes it's making the same brushstroke over and over again and letting your hands settle into the rhythm. There's something really peaceful about that. You don't always have to be figuring out what comes next. Sometimes you can just be here, making the next mark. And now we're approaching our final layer, the shimmer watercolor. This is one of those layers where you may not be able to see everything that's happening while you're painting, but trust me, you don't want to skip it. Once the piece catches the light, that shimmer adds a little bit of magic. A lot of magic. I like to use it sparingly, and I work fairly quickly so my marks stay loose and expressive. I'm not adding shimmer to every berry, every leaf, or every detail, just little touches here and there. That way, when you move the finished piece into the light, you get those unexpected little moments where the shimmer catches and the piece comes to life. I've shared this before, but when I'm choosing my shimmer watercolors, I like to match them as closely as possible to the colors already in my painting. I'm really using the shimmer to accent what's already there, rather than introduce a lot of new contrast. The exception is when I bring in something like gold or silver. I like those metallic touches to be the little unexpected surprise, the marks you might not notice right away, but then the light catches them and suddenly, there they are. This is also a great opportunity to add another layer of detail to your berries, especially if you're using shimmer colors that are similar to the colors already on your page. I decided to add a few tiny shimmer dots here and there. They blend into the berries rather than competing with them, so they become this subtle extra layer of texture, something you may not notice at first, but that reveals itself when the light catches it. This shimmer palette has quite a few blues, but it doesn't have the really deep, dark blue I'm looking for. It does have a black though, and I like to use that when I want to create a deeper purple or an almost midnight blue. So I'm bringing a little bit of that into the darker areas of the berries and the lettering, following the shadows and the deeper hues that are already there. Sometimes when I paint the little hearts, they're so tiny that I'll leave them without shimmer because I don't want to lose those delicate lines trying to go back over them. But this one was a comfortable enough size that I felt like I could add a little shimmer while still keeping the shape and those thin strokes intact. I'm also bringing a little shimmer into the lettering, but again, just in a few small details. I added a slightly thicker shimmer line along the top of the J, and then repeated a pattern of 3 tiny shimmer dots on the different parts of the letters as little accents. I love repeating those small details throughout a piece. They help everything feel connected while still leaving those little moments of shimmer for you to discover. I'm also adding a little shimmer to the background texture, but very sparingly. I'm only choosing a few of the lines, and even then I'm adding shimmer to just small sections rather than covering the entire line. For me, if everything shimmers, the shimmer starts to feel ordinary, but when it only appears here and there, it becomes something your eye gets to discover as it moves around the painting. Those little moments of shimmer give your eye somewhere to travel, and I think that's what keeps the magic feeling magical. The more you create, and the more experience you gain, the more you realize that developing your creative voice isn't only about knowing what to add, it's also about knowing when something has had enough. Especially when you're having fun, it can be really tempting to just keep going. Add another mark, another detail, another layer, because technically a piece never has to be finished. You could keep adding and changing things forever. At some point, you get to decide when enough is enough. And learning to recognize that moment is part of developing your creative voice too. For me, the final detail in this piece is going to be a little gold shimmer, and I'm adding it as a loose splatter across the berries and the background. I love having those tiny marks add another layer of texture and a little softness without overwhelming everything we've created. A quick tip for shimmer splatter: make sure you're using a good amount of water. If you're having trouble getting your paint to splatter, chances are you need to add a little more. I also find that a smaller brush gives me the kind of splatter I love: smaller, rounder, more delicate dots, while a larger brush tends to create bigger marks. So experiment with your brushes and see which texture you prefer. And now for our final step, peeling the piece off the block and taking in all those little details we've been building up. This is one of my favorite parts. All of it is my favorite part. I enjoy it all. But seeing the piece as a whole after spending so much time focused on all those tiny individual moments. So take a second to look at yours, move it around in the light, catch that shimmer, and enjoy what you created.
Thank you so much for joining me in the studio. I hope that you're walking away with some beautiful wild blueberries that brought you joy. And I would love to see what you painted. If you're watching this on YouTube, please share a picture in the community tab. Or if you're watching this on Facebook, you can share a picture in the comments of this video. I look forward to seeing you in the studio again soon. I've got another tutorial coming next week. So until next time, stay wild.